Well, good morning all, and welcome to the second plenary session. I think we're a few minutes after 9, but I think we probably should get started. I know there'll be more people coming from the breakfast room or directly from their hotel rooms as we get started on this second plenary session, which has the title of Sovereignty. My name is Hendrik Kraay. I am, among other things, history department head at the University of Calgary. I'm an historian of Brazil, so I've been sort of, one sense, distant from all of these discussions, but at the same time, as 19th century Brazil, 19th century South America shares many of the same issues and themes we've been talking about. Now, one of the good things about being the moderator of a session is that I'm actually not charged with actually saying anything particularly intelligent. But I do think I want to say a few remarks about what we might be trying to do in this session here with the title of Sovereignty. And we've, of course, talked a great deal about sovereignty, and I think the panelists may have got something of a charge to reflect a little bit on the concept of sovereignty, its utility, how we're going to define it, and so forth. And over the last day and a half, we've heard a whole lot of different ways of talking about sovereignty, different breadth of the concept, different scopes of the concept, varieties of actors and institutions claiming it. I think we've gone from divine sovereignty all the way down to individual sovereignty, as well as a collective sovereignty, various institutions and groups claiming sovereignty. We've also had an enormous number of adjectives describing sovereignty: divided, complete, incomplete, fictional, real, effective, a moving target. Last night we even had it analogized to spandex. We could talk about sovereignty as well as being sort of recognized and acknowledged explicitly or claimed by institutions or groups, or assumed as something that, or perhaps sovereignty in some of our discussions has been sort of assumed by us as observers, or using something to describe something as a concept that contemporaries might not have recognized in that way. So I guess the question, one of the issues we might want to be looking at today is bringing some kind of focus to this, or perhaps it's not possible to do so. Perhaps there are so many different ways of thinking about sovereignty that we'll never all agree on what it might be. But that might be one thing that we could be thinking about in the course of this session. So that's basically my very short and brief spiel. You didn't come to hear me. So let me introduce our first presenter this morning, who is Jay Sexton, who is a fellow and tutor, associate professor, university lecturer in American history at Corpus Christi College in Oxford. He's written a number of books, and some of his major publications include, in 2011, The Monroe Doctrine, Empire and Nation in 19th Century America, and in 2005, Debtor Diplomacy, Finance in American Foreign Relations in the Civil War Era. And the title of his paper this morning, which we will just talk about briefly, and of course to remind everyone, this is not a formal presentation session, this is a short discussion of the issues raised by the paper that we hopefully have all had a chance to look at. So the title of the paper that we're going to be talking about today is Steam Transport, Sovereignty and Empire in North America, 1850 to 1885. Jay?
Well, thank you very much. Very excited to be here. I want to add my thanks to Frank and all the institutions which made this conference possible. I also want to say I'm excited because this is the first time I've written a paper on this project. I've been researching it for about 4 years, and so I'm very excited. So shut me down, Chair, if I go for more than 10 minutes. What I'm doing is I'm writing a history of two big concepts, what I call steam imperialism and transport capitalism. And I'm doing that through the prism of the largest U.S. oceanic steamship company of the 19th century, the most important company you've never heard of, Pacific Mail Steamship Company. It's the only steamship company that's established in the 1840s when there's an initial federal interest in pump priming the U.S. steam industry. It's the only one to persist and to last through the 19th century. And as you read the paper, it starts off operating one line of the Panama route from San Francisco to Panama City, but then it expands to govern the actual railroad crossing, the Atlantic side from New York, and then after the Civil War operates the first Trans-Pacific steam line in 1867 from San Francisco to Yokohama, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, and then opens up the first regular service to Australia and New Zealand in the 1870s. Now, I got into this project really through these sorts of conferences. I've seen many of you at these global Civil War conferences over the last couple of years. I should add, this one is second to none. This one is fantastic, not least because we have the mountains. But one of the things that came up in all of these conferences was that we just don't know enough about the connections between different places in the 19th century. I'm a pretty hard-headed historian. I like to think concretely, more on that in a second. But I realized we needed to know more about how these entanglements, these cross-border transnationalisms, whatever you want to call them, how they actually functioned, how they were born, and how they operated. And I think we've seen that in this conference, that steam transport is very important. It's important in its own right, and that's what I'm interested in, how it's important in its own right, but it's also important as an underlying structure that facilitates and shapes the various connections with which projects like this are interested in. Now, a couple of people have asked me the last couple of days about they didn't realize the transition from the age of sail and animal power to the age of steam, that it was so important. So I wanted to start by just saying why I think it's that important. I didn't say this in my paper. I think it's important for 4 reasons. The first reason is the one that you're probably most familiar with, and I think this is the least important, but it's still important, and that is the annihilation of time and space. Right? That's what we normally talk about or think about when we talk about steam. Places that previously took months to connect between one another could be done so in a matter of days or weeks. So I talk in the paper about the New York to San Francisco connection, which before the 1850s it would take months, 4, 5, 6 months, depending on winds, depending on your route. After 1855, you could do this in a matter of 3 to 4 weeks. That's not as important as the second factor, or the second thing I want to draw to your attention, and that is the regularity of exchange. It's the regularity of exchange. It's the regularly timetabled services which matter just as much as do the annihilation or the compression of time and space. If you're in San Francisco after 1855, you know when you're going to get that letter from your wife or from your business partner. And it has all sorts of implications for social history, for the conduct of business and political relations. The third thing that I think is important are the route networks. Who controls steam route networks? Which places are connected? And just as importantly, which places are not connected? Which places are left off the grid? This is something I'm very interested in. This is something that contemporary historical actors were very much aware of and spent quite a bit of energy debating and challenging one another to get on those steam route networks. And the fourth thing that I think is important, this is the one that I am most interested in, is an implication of steam. The capital costs, the very high capital costs, the logistical complexity of long-haul steam transport required a series of innovations, a series of changes. Changes in the corporate form, the form that would manage steam transport, changes in political economy, the relationship between private companies and the state, and innovations, most importantly, in the markets. And if you're talking about steam transport in the 19th century, the markets that you've got to talk about are first the money markets, that is Wall Street, the stock market, the bond market, and secondly, just as importantly, coal markets which just come into being. And the chapter on coal is the only chapter I've written, so I'm burning to go on coal if you want to ask about that. Now, these changes occur not just in the United States, across the continent. I try to do that, and I have a capacious definition of the continent, as do others. I'm interested in the Caribbean and Central America, as well as Mexico, the United States, and Canada. But of course, they happen around the world at the same time. Now, the old literature, the nationalist literature of steam transport, I want to be crystal clear, is not wrong. It's very, very good. I think the nationalist paradigm for understanding the implications of these changes is central. But I want to add to it rather than to demolish it. And I want to think about empire and the imperial dimensions of steam transport. And I do this in 2 ways. First, at a macro level, And that means a global level, and in this period that means thinking about the British Empire, Victorian integration, whatever you want to call it, and placing the North American story in that broader British frame. But I'm also interested in doing it at a micro level, zooming in along the new transport routes. And when you do that, and when we think about sovereignty, what I think we're thinking about is corporate sovereignty, the power of steam transport corporations. So empire is one frame I'm interested in this paper. The other I introduced at the end, I'm not going to talk about it, I'm just going to flag it up, is something I just kind of came up with, invented to fit with the conference. And I added, qualified the idea of sovereignty, this idea of market sovereignty. And at first, I wasn't quite sure if this would work, but actually, I kind of like this. I think I've been the blind squirrel that stumbled across a nut. But you can tell me if I'm wrong, if market sovereignty works as a concept. I think it's very important to think about the sovereignty of publicly traded companies on the marketplace. And that's an important dimension that comes into being actually in this period in the mid-19th century. I'm going to end now, but I'm going to end with a broader point. And this is the bee that's been in my bonnet for as long as I've been a historian. The global turn, transnationalism, the continental perspective, whatever we're doing, a lot of people tend to argue that the great challenge, the great barrier is conceptual or theoretical. We need to think about how we do this as a project, as an enterprise. And I have a lot of respect for that, and I appreciate the people that do that. But I in turn want the people who do that to respect and appreciate what I'm interested in, and that is the greatest barrier I see to this project is methodological. It's empirical rather than conceptual. And the challenge here is twofold. Most simply, it's a challenge of collecting data, of finding new evidence, and that's what I've been doing in the last several years. And for this project, it means developing an awareness of the route networks. We don't actually know which port cities were connected to one another by regularly timetabled steam service in the mid-19th century. And I'm trying to do that. I think I've done that for 1860, and I'm trying to do it for about 1880. But I'm interested in more than that. I'm interested in coal prices. Coal prices are very important. Share prices. Fares, I have a database of the fluctuations in fares between New York and San Francisco. Between 1850 and 1870, and I can map that on to changes in coal prices. I can map that on to competition from different routes and networks. So there's a challenge, an empirical challenge. Underlying that, or the next step, is the bigger challenge, and that is how do we interpret this data that we collect? How do we make sense of it? And that's what I think we haven't talked nearly enough about. And I'll just give you one example of the problem of doing this, which I bring up in the paper, but I don't discuss explicitly, and that is something I use a lot, and that is share prices. How do we interpret changes in share prices in the mid-19th century? The big question here, of course, is do fluctuations in the bond market and in the stock market, do they reflect changes and developments amongst steam transport companies? Or do they drive changes in steam transport companies? That's the big question. And obviously the answer is both. It depends on time and place. And I do my best to try to choose which is the right at the right time. But I don't think we have refined tools yet to answer that question. And if we did, I wouldn't be here today. I'd be on a private villa up on top of one of these mountains, sipping on my Rothschild Bordeaux and looking down on you with all of my money. And that's where I'm going to end.
Thank you very much, Jay. Our next presenter is Christopher Clark, who is professor and department head at the University of Connecticut, and I certainly sympathize with his second role. His current research interests are in ideas about rural society, land reform in the U.S. and overseas. He is the author of a number of books, including The Social Change in America from the Revolution to the Civil War from 2006, the communitarian moment, radical challenge of the Northampton Association, 1995, and the roots of rural capitalism in 1990. Without further ado, Christopher.
Thank you, Hendrik, for that sympathetic introduction. And thanks to Frank and everybody who has been responsible for arranging this extraordinary conference, both in terms of place and for me, the opportunity to meet with old friends and to make new friends. It's really been a wonderful experience. I also have one other thank you to give, and that is to the mystery person who was making comments on papers that I saw got filed on the Dropbox last week. I refer to this person mentally as the phantom commentator. I thought it was Bruce, but he denies it, so there's somebody else. And I'm very grateful to them because they drew attention to some important things. Whoever they are. We've talked about sovereignty from the top, so to speak, about the establishment of territorial claims and borders in the North American polities in the middle of the 19th century. But I also want to look at sovereignty, as it were, literally on the ground, about property systems and ways of thinking about property systems. At some point in the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln made notes for a speech in which he was going to ask his audience, I think this will have been in Illinois, would they rather be in Canada or in South Carolina? And his implicit answer to that, of course not, because as he said, equality beats inequality, whether of the British aristocratic sort or the domestic slavery sort. So what he was referring to was the fragmentation of North America, not by its political boundaries or formal political sovereignty, but by its social systems, and what he presented as the advantages of what he saw as an egalitarian social system, as against the colonialism and aristocracy he associated with Britain and the British Empire, and the slavery and aristocracy that he associated with the South. By 1875, however, we could argue that this fragmented geography had been replaced by a more uniform, theoretically egalitarian property system across the United States and Canada. I've called the notion that Lincoln was projecting a notion of a society of independent proprietors, the free soil vision, a society free of aristocrats and free of slaves. And I follow Gregory Downes in arguing that the proponents and the actors who brought about this vision were revolutionaries. During this period, they succeeded in destroying slavery, projecting national sovereignty across North America. They set about dispossessing indigenous people, and they set about converting huge areas of land to private property. And I'm not sure if that's not revolutionary, what would be, but we can discuss that. One of my main points is that we should see the end of the Civil War and the consolidation of Canada under Confederation as a process which helped unleash unprecedented agrarian expansion across the continent in the following 60 years. In the US and Canada, there were something just over 2 million farms in 1860. By 1920, there were over 7 million. And I could argue, I think, that this expansion was a practical effort to realize that free soil vision. Interpretations of agrarian expansion during the late 19th century have tended to be top-down. They have either focused on the extension or consolidation of state power, or on the extension of market power and capitalist institutions. And both of those strands are important. But I think we also need to understand how settlers and the participants in this movement engaged with these political and economic processes themselves. They were not just the victims of forces that rolled over them from the state or from the market. They helped constitute them. They were constitutive of them. A common facet of this process was the deep attachment to the concept of freehold property, and particularly from the middle of the 19th, that wasn't new, but particularly from the middle of the 19th century, of freehold property as an epitome of civilized society. The Homestead Act in the United States, the Dominion Lands Act of the early 1870s in Canada, expressed this notion. Yes, these were, as James Scott has told us, implements of state power. The freehold system is a state ascribed system. But it also inscribed the aspirations for independence of the people who took advantage of the system and made use of it to establish their own farms, farmsteads, and communities. There were local and regional, as well as central, extensions of these ideals. In my paper, I referred back to Patricia Seed's important work on the early colonization or early exploration of North America by European powers and the ceremonies of possession that she called, marking symbolically the claims to sovereignty that representatives of European monarchies made in North America and the Caribbean in the 16th and 17th century. I suggest that there are hundreds of thousands of these little ceremonies of possession that take place in farmsteads across North America in the late 19th century. I talk about agricultural organizations, I talk about the efforts for agricultural improvement, crop choices and technologies, which are all to some extent adapted to local and regional and individual farm families' needs, as well as to the exigencies of state or market. We see numerous efforts from below to confront indigenous landholders, to secure military aid, to support, to obtain the support of state institutions, to assist in the establishment of these agrarian activities. What Ariel Ron has called the process of summoning the state. People bring the state in to do what they want it to do to support them. I talk about contests over the fear of land monopoly in the late 19th century and argue that in many ways this fear starts to recede. And we see the strength of the free soil ideology in various aspects of late 19th century agrarian development. The attacks on indigenous land systems, the efforts to force Native Americans to take part in the farming system by the allotment process, forcing Native Americans, unsuccessfully in many cases, to become farmers themselves. We see the free soil system as a model for the development of agriculture on the Great Plains. And we see international developments of this movement. I write briefly about the elements of what I am starting to call the populist international of the late 19th century. But I also remark that this system eventually comes to fail. It failed early in the South in the failure, large-scale failure of the realization of the dream of securing property for freed people, although many African Americans struggled and succeeded in obtaining land for themselves in the late 19th century. This was largely from their own initiative and activity rather than anything that was done for them. We see the resistance from indigenous people to the efforts to make them conform to this system. But we also see deeper structural weaknesses in this system that arise from the land-labor ratio and the fundamental shortage of labor that the farming system has to address. And one of the arguments that I will make is that we should not see this process of agricultural expansion that I've described as simply the forerunner of modern North American farming. We should see it actually as a distinct phase which succeeded rapidly in the later 19th century, but then broke down in the early 20th century and was replaced really by another system that has built the modern farming system that we know. So I think I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Our next presenter is Mary Ryan, who holds the John Martin Vincent Professorship at Johns Hopkins University. She is the author of numerous books, and some of her more recent work include Civic Wars, Democracy and Public Life in the City During the 19th Century, 1997, and The Mysteries of Sex, Tracing Women and Men Through American History, 2006. Her current work is a book manuscript entitled Taking the Land to Make the City, A Bicoastal History, and I believe that her paper today entitled City Sovereignty from Mexico to the United States, 1846 to 1866, is based on that project.
I too need to add a big thanks to Frank and Bill, the people who conceived this conference, to all the organizers that made it come off without a glitch, and particularly for bringing me here. I think, in fact, I'm the luckiest person in this room because I wasn't invited to any of those other Civil War conferences. And in fact, I have very rarely in my career gone to such conferences. I'm an outsider here in a certain way. My work has been first in women's and gender history, and now increasingly in urban history. So I come to the issues in this panel in particular from somewhere else, from that book manuscript. I don't even know if you'd call it a manuscript yet, a draft, which is designed not around any abstract concept. It is actually takes off from a very material, palpable, physical space, actually two spaces, two great estuaries, one on the eastern side of the continent, the Chesapeake, the other on the west, San Francisco Bay. And that is a very strategic decision on my part because I wanted to write an urban history that was panoramic, and not only that it moved from the Pacific side and up from Central America rather than from the Northeast, which is so repeated in our history textbooks and in our conversations. So that is the way I proceeded. But from that, once I fell into that, and particularly moved for the first time into San Francisco and bringing it down the Pacific coast, I found that I stumbled on the concept of sovereignty. Because in fact, in just the first half of the 19th century in San Francisco, on that territory, on that physical space, sovereignty, if we define it in national terms, changed 3 times. First, the people called Ohlone today were displaced by the Spanish Empire. Then the Spanish Empire was very quickly displaced by the Republic of Mexico, and then the United States comes in and acquires the the territory of California. So that's where I start. And what I'm looking for there, my telos, is to find how you make a city on these two places. My interest and my focus is on sovereignty, not on sovereignty per se, but on the transformation of the landscape and the creation of cities. Specifically, those 2 cities, Baltimore Maryland, and San Francisco, California. Now, I'm going to try to very quickly sort of recapitulate my argument about landscaped by referring to these images that have been nicely reproduced, but actually badly distorted by me on the computer. They've been all elongated. I've sort of created an El Greco effect for you today, a little artistry. But I think it very quickly shows that transformations of national sovereignty have a very big consequence on the look at the land. That first one is a Mexican dueño of the rancho of Jose Jesus Noe. You can see it shows a kind of open, porous, ill-defined sense of space on the San Francisco Peninsula. The second one shows, again, a kind of eclectic creation of what I think is the first kind of pseudo-urban space in San Francisco, in the lots that were created up around the old mission of San Francisco de Asís. If you turn the page, you're moving about 10 years, but you're changing sovereignty, and look what you get. A classic American grid. All those rectangles, all those plots of private property. And if you turn the page, yet if you go down the page, you see that grid taking over the spaces of the old Establecimiento de Dolores. And if you go yet another 10 years, you would find that we have essentially the map of San Francisco today, which coincidentally is probably the costliest real estate in this country. Probably in North America, maybe even beyond. And I tell you the story, a lot of it's tied up in that legal story, a very convoluted story about the Pueblo. And to me, that shows, on the one hand, a sort of colossal transnational irony, that in fact, the municipal authorities and the real estate speculators of San Francisco are using Mexican and Spanish law in order to convert the land of San Francisco around San Francisco Bay into real estate capitalism and private property. So that's an irony. But within that irony, I would also say that there is a real critical importance of sovereignty, but sovereignty exercised at the local level and in municipal institutions. Before I would make some qualifications of that, I wanted to call attention to one last map, which I included with my paper, and I make no comment on it. If I were to comment on it, I would like you to note that this is not a grid. I would like you to also note that is on the territory of Noe's diseño, that it does say an enduring legacy of Mexican California on our national landscape. Because that looks to me, and as I would tell people if I were at a landscape conference, this is a kind of premonition of the major landscape form of the 20th century, a suburb with curvilinear streets lined up with tract housing. So that's the point I would make for landscape architecture. I want you to look more carefully at that map, and I'm afraid, I guess you can read it. Maybe some of you have already noted, because I think on the surface, it totally contradicts what I'm saying. Because at the top of the map, there's the name Lincoln. Beneath it, there's a Stanton, and there's a Seward, and below that, there's a Douglas. So it seems like, oh, really, what really happened in the end by this date, 1867, is the nation state, a more centralized nation state. Those political leaders are really mapping the city of San Francisco. Okay, I think we have to recognize that have to read maps and particularly read advertisements from real estate speculators very carefully. So in order to pursue my research further, I actually took my map in hand and I walked up to Twin Peaks, the top of the map, and I looked for Lincoln, and there's no Lincoln. The name on that street is Burnett, and if you recall, Burnett was the governor of the territory of California. Burnett is also a principal in the case Hart v. Burnett, which goes up through the Supreme Court and conveys on San Francisco, on the municipality, the land of the Pueblo. And for purposes of the discussion among Civil War historians, you might note as well that Peter Burnett was responsible in San Francisco and with fellows in other cities of Sacramento and San Jose for convening a convention to create a constitution for California. And he calculated that, in fact, they had to work at the local level because it's December of 1849. They're never going to get a government to straighten things out in the middle of the gold rush if they're going to rely on the United States Congress that doesn't want to admit another state which will change the balance between North and South. So they convene as a bunch of local cronies in Monterey. They write a constitution, and they outlaw slavery with not a lot of dissent. So the point in the end is, I'd make 2 points. I'll hold to my ground that municipal sovereignty is important in terms of what happens on the ground, but also what happens up the ladder of sovereignty to the federal level. I'd really like to comment from a less provincial level about all this, but perhaps we'll have a chance to discuss that later and very soon.
Thank you very much, Mary. Our next presenter, and actually the last of our presenters before the commentator, is Maria Dolores Ballesteros Pa, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Centro de Investigaciones de la América Latina y del Caribe at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She's a native of Spain and recently completed her PhD at ITESM in Monterrey with a study of Mexican history textbooks. And her presentation today is entitled Indigenous Populations in the Mexican, U.S., and Canadian Congressional Debates and Bills in the Consolidation of New National States from 1865 to 67. Ola, please.
First of all, I would like to thank the people that were involved in the organization of this Congress for letting me be here, and especially to Frank Towers for his support during all these months, and I would like to thank all of you for being here and not being up there. Secondly, I would like to point out that this paper is my first approach to a well-developed area, as it is the analysis of past and present political discourses towards the indigenous populations in these three countries. Although I have analyzed other types of discourses, such as textbooks or 19th century historical and travel narratives, the characteristics of this type of legal and political discourses both make the analysis more complex and richer, with its passive structures, its implicit logical arguments, and its powerful silences. In this paper, I offer a critical discourse analysis of the Mexican, U.S., and Canadian congressional and/or constituent assembly debates, acts, and constitutions during a critical stretch for all these three countries, in order to understand how the indigenous populations, present and future, was conceived by the political leaders in these young nations. In this text, the position of the indigenous populations in the nation depended on several factors, but the most determinant one was if they were so-called wild Indians or not. In the three countries, if the indigenous populations abandoned their culture, they could obtain certain rights as inhabitants of those nations or even as citizens. In Mexico, the Constitution gave the population in general the right to be called Mexicans and citizens, while in the same document, wild Indians, or savages, as they called them, were explicitly excluded from those rights, justifying the war against them with the support of the neighbor nation. In the US, although some politicians were opposed, if they paid taxes, if they became farmers over a piece of land, they were citizens. In Canada, in 1857, the Gradual Civilization Act had ruled over the enfranchisement of the indigenous individuals, and I quote, "Commissioners shall report in writing to the governor that any such Indian of the male sex and not under 21 years of age is able to speak, read, and write either the English or the French language readily, and while it's sufficiently advanced in the elementary branches of education and is of good moral character and free from debt, then they could be enfranchised." So most of the white population couldn't with this kind of characteristic. It's the assimilation into the national culture what made them part of the nation. Meanwhile, the wild Indians, the populations who did not abandon their culture, were excluded, considered outsiders to the nation, and in most cases, a violent entity that threatened its progress. In fact, the lexicon, the types of nouns and adjectives chosen to describe the two different types of indigenous populations differ and contrast quite dramatically. One group is described as savages, wild, barbarous, killers, robbers in the three cases. The other group, the other type of Indian adapted. The other is not enlightened enough, not educated, exploited by the Catholic Church, forced to move from their homes, in the case of the US. The first group is indomitable. There is no way to deal with them but to fight them, or in certain circumstances, negotiate treaties as different nations. The second can be rescued. They only lack education, civilization, something that they could achieve by living with, unlike the white men, as those politicians argued. In order to make these distinctions, the text presents the four edges of the ideological square that Theon Van Dyck has developed extensively, emphasizing the positive information about us and the negative information about the others, de-emphasizing positive information about them and the negative information about us. Taking one example from the US congressional debates, the inner group, the white man, appears defined by positive adjectives. Quote, "The hardy, persevering, industrious, brave, and intelligent Anglo-Saxon race and their descendants who brought civilization and the arts into the New World, while the indigenous populations are defined as semi-barbarous inferiors, never evinced the intelligence necessary to better their own condition, living the most barbarous life." In fact, when the positive elements of the indigenous population are rescued in these discourses are mostly for argumentative purposes, to back the ideas of the speaker, not to praise the indigenous populations. For example, certain Mexican Assembly constituents blame the Catholic Church for the overexploitation of the indigenous populations or for not being enlightened enough, more worried about attacking the church than defending the indigenous populations. In this text, the main difference between the Mexican and the US and Canadian cases was the recognition of the indigenous population's sovereignty over their lands. Leaving aside certain radical positions that I found in the US and I reflected in the paper, US and Canadian policymakers recognized Indians' rights over the lands. Quoting a US senator, they were the owners of the soil itself, of the continent originally, and never to be divested of that ownership except by an honest and fair treaty. This differs from the Mexican experience. Some Assembly constituents recognize the indigenous right over the land as hands of the field, as peasants who will work them, in contrast with the Catholic Church. But there was no treaty signing after the Mexican independence, no recognition of their sovereignty, because in their discourse, liberals presented themselves as the heirs of the Aztec civilization and indigenous people, either as part of the Mexican society or as nomadic tribes. Leaving aside these differences between the three countries, in this remaking of the North American sovereignty, the new liberal subject is strengthened for the indigenous populations in Mexico, both under the liberal government of Juarez and the empire of Maximilian. That meant losing their privileges over their land and a certain amount of self-government rights, because the national subject was based on the liberal principle that tried to end with the all privileges of corporations. In the US, although declared as foreign nations in the Constitution, there were increasingly more and more debates about the role of the US government as a civilizing agent of the indigenous populations, or with the right to put them in reservation as wards, as what we heard yesterday. In Canada, the indigenous population passed from negotiating treaties directly with the Crown to having a commissioner supervising their lands and evaluating their capacity for being enfranchised. Besides, this change toward the liberal subject brought their disappearance in the public political debate. For example, in the Mexican case, there is no active intention in avoiding mentioning the indigenous population, conscious under lexicalization to refer to the group, as it is only by indirect ways that we can find reference to them in legislation as land workers or helpless people. In the US, in general, the indigenous populations are perceived as obstacles to the construction of national sovereignty in the three nations, and in each case, there is an effort to minimize or silence their presence in the past and present of the national territory. In the paper, the Canadian case is perhaps the clear example, but can also be found in the US narrative of the country of immigrants, or in the Mexican liberal images produced in this period, in which the dead Indian is praised and the one alive is forgotten. How to create and consolidate a new liberal unified nation with the presence of groups who had had autonomy from the government for centuries? The answer for these politicians was silencing their past, minimizing their present existence, and hoping that assimilation will create the desired homogeneity. That answer is not exclusive of 19th century politicians. Sadly, a short review of recent newspapers can illustrate that these seemingly old debates are current issues, at least in Mexico. And we can ask ourselves again that to what extent are the indigenous people full members of these nations? I will thank you for your comments and suggestions, because this is I keep working on this paper. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lola. So we're moving along very nicely. I thank the presenters for keeping within the 10 minutes. Now I'd like to turn it over to our commentator, Bruce Levine, who is the G.J. Randall Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Illinois. He's the author of a number of books, most recently, The Fall of the House of Dixie, The Civil War and the Social Revolution That Transformed the South, 2013, and Confederate Emancipation, Southern Plans to Free and Arm Slaves During the Civil War, 2005. Please.
Thanks, Hendrik. And now it's my turn to thank Frank and Bill and Matt and Barbie and others, both for the conference and my presence here. Quite a gift. These 4 interesting papers deal, among other things, with the spread of a farm population across the continent, the Native American and Hispanic peoples whose expropriation and removal made that possible, the complex system of political sovereignty that oversaw and legally sanctified these processes, and the steam-powered transportation systems that facilitated, but in some ways also, in fact, complicated those processes and many others. Yesterday, Mark Agnall urged more attention to economic motives in the themes that we're discussing at this conference. And while I don't always agree with the ways Mark answers that question, and in fact, we sometimes seem to have a running discussion, debate about that from one conference to the next, I do think that more attention to economic processes underway do illuminate questions of state building and collateral themes very significantly. And a few papers on this panel start to do that. Chris Clark tells us that key to the U.S. experience between 1845 and 1875 was a spectacular agrarian expansion. And this, he continues, occurred primarily on the basis of small-scale farms held in fee simple as freeholds, an agricultural system that Chris dubs free soil. He notes that these farmers, moreover, far from being passive before or simply victims of the state, frequently call upon the states for assistance in dealing, for example, both with Native Americans, but also to obtain other measures that they sought to facilitate settlement and farm making. And the limits of this system were reached, he says, only at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. This, I think, is a very valuable reminder as we consider the social context and the social bases of sovereignty. Much writing about the late 19th century United States focuses upon the growth of cities, the urban middle class, manufacturing, and the booming industrial workforce. Compared with the amount of attention that historians have paid to those subjects, modern study of the enormous legally free farm population, its conditions, culture, and perhaps especially its politics, with the single exception, I think, of populism, lags far behind. But I do have some questions about the argument and the presentation in Chris's fine paper. The first is his referring to the system of small-scale family agriculture as free soil. Historically, that phrase referred not to the size of farms, but to the absence of slavery on farms. Those anxious to see land made available to small farmers as low-cost freeholds generally referred not to free soil, but to free land or to land reform. In the southern states before the Civil War, therefore, non-plantation agriculture was also largely organized on the basis of small-scale freeholds. But we would not call that system free soil. And so the free soil terminology would seem to exclude or obscure the nature of this important sector of antebellum Southern agriculture. And more importantly, perhaps, I wonder whether the form of agriculture that Chris describes fits even the postbellum, post-slavery South very well. He says here that the Civil War saw the dismantling of the plantation system. But while the war and its aftermath certainly did destroy slavery, and in most places plantation-based gang labor, they did not break up the plantations in many places into small farms. As Clark's fine book, Social Change in America, notes, plantations persisted in cotton and tobacco culture. And the flip side of that fact, as Clark's paper notes, was that most American freed people worked plantation lands as tenants and especially as sharecroppers after the war. So it was that the 1890 census reported that while in the country as a whole, almost 3/4 of all farms were cultivated by their own owners, in Alabama and Mississippi, owner-cultivated farms made up only about 1/2 of the total number in those states, centers of antebellum slavery. I said earlier that the focus on agriculture in the 19th century helps remind us of the presence and importance, both economically and politically, of this huge sector of the national population in that era. But it's also important to keep in mind that the great physical expansion of agriculture that Chris described so well, and the multiplication of small farms that this expansion entailed, did occur simultaneously with and in the context of an even more dramatic expansion in the size of non-agricultural production, which made the United States the premier manufacturing power in the world at the turn of the century, massive expansion of non-agricultural wealth, and significant expansion of the non-agricultural population and the social classes that composed it. In 1890, the non-farm workforce exceeded 13 million people, compared with a farm workforce of 10 million people. So it's 13 non-farm and 10 farm. As measured in terms of value added by industry in 1899, moreover, agriculture accounted for $3.4 billion, but manufacturing accounted for more, $5 billion and change. So when we quite appropriately remind ourselves of the imposing size and significance of agriculture throughout the 19th century, we should also be asking ourselves how agriculture and farmers were affected, both economically and politically, by the titanic growth of industry and industry-related sectors and of the influence and political weight of those who controlled those sectors and how they influenced this farm population, their control of political sovereignty. And more broadly, what are the implications of this expansion of agriculture for the development of political sovereignty and the shape of political sovereignty and the nature of clashes at the political level? Which brings us, in its own way, to J. Sexton's paper, which focuses on the relationship among economics, sovereignty, and technological advance in the form of steam-powered railroads and ships. Jay affirms that these forms of transportation played important roles in cohering nations. They did so in the United States, as he suggests, in part by knitting together separate markets into common national markets. And they did so as well by accelerating white settlement of the continent and displacing Native Americans from it. It's also useful to recall some other ways in which the improvements that these innovations wrought in transportation shaped and reshaped government and politics. Transportation and the commerce that it facilitates, as Jay ably reminds us, especially later in the paper, can serve not only as social, cultural, and national glues, but also as powerful solvents in the same facets of life. Thus, the development of east-west railroad transportation, precisely by knitting together more distant markets, undermined the position of many marginal farmers in the East. Second, as William Seward and others pointed out, the greater travel and communication that occurred in the antebellum era between the North and South increased the sectional frictions between them. Parenthetically, Frederick Douglass made his escape from Baltimore to Philadelphia by train. East-West railroad transportation in those years helped reorient Midwestern farmers, both economically and politically, away from the slave South and toward the industrializing and urbanizing Northeast, thereby helping to isolate the South politically and thereby accelerate, in the short run at least, not national cohesion, but the fracturing of the nation in the process that culminated in secession. But finally, railroads and their unequal development in the United States and the Confederacy figured importantly also in the military conduct and outcome of the Civil War, and therefore of the kind of nation that would emerge from that war. But Jay and his paper focused less on steam transport's domestic impact than on its transnational and imperial consequences, especially how U.S. steam power related to existing British steam networks, which constituted both models and rivals for the Americans. Also, how steam transport networks influenced the size, extent, and nature of formal empires, for example, pulling Canada more firmly into the British Empire, and offering another, thereby, economic dimension to the process that Phil Buckner described yesterday, as well as informal empires, thus increasing U.S. power in Panama, Colombia, and Cuba, and the kinds of resistance, finally, that the growth of steam transport and its effects triggered. Jay points to three sources of contestation: those who represented the loss of sovereignty caused by the power of foreign-owned steam transport networks, for example, Mexico, Central America, and even Japan. Second, rival companies. And third, the collision within the U.S. between these new networks and what Sexton calls anti-monopolism, anti-statism, and populism. And say that again, anti-monopolism, anti-statism, and populism. Of course, those three traditions did not always operate in tandem. For example, to counter what they regarded as exploitative, coercive, and generally unjust conduct by railroad corporations, populist-minded farmers in the United States regularly called upon government to increase its role in national life. And at the very least, by taking control over freight rates out of private hands, but more often than not, or at least often, by doing much more than that, by demanding the seizure, the nationalization of the railroads altogether. And so, the growing scale of production, financial, and transportation networks often compelled not only entrepreneurs, but also their critics and opponents to make national governments more central than previously to their plans and programs. Which brings us once again to the impact on economic processes and change on sovereignty and collateral political issues. Mary Ryan looks at the existence of multiple levels of sovereignty and, more specifically, the confusion and conflicts among local, municipal, state, and federal sovereignty in the act of resettling, governing, and especially disposing of real property in San Francisco after its seizure from Mexico. The significance of the general issue, divided sovereignty, is potentially, of course, very great, especially where different social or political groups lay hands on different levels of government. Again, the classic U.S. case was the sectional conflict over slavery, in which slaveholders enshrined the right of state governments precisely in order to limit potentially dangerous use of federal power, as Tony Kaye reminded us yesterday. Ironically, a structurally similar contest unfolded within the Confederacy during its brief life during the Civil War, where especially governors of North Carolina and Georgia, by emphasizing the rights of their states as opposed to the government in Richmond, made an impact, and not a positive one, on the war-making power of the Confederacy. And such issues, of course, also remain live down to the present day, as, for example, civil rights issues pivoting and posing federal versus state power, and today, in the contest between New York City and New York State, trying to figure out who has actual sovereignty over New York City. In the case at hand, Mary has discovered that individuals were able to capitalize on the disruption of sovereignty during the early phase of U.S. control to use local government to dictate the terms of land disposition and ownership. The federal government was in these years apparently too distracted by the escalating sectional conflict to attend to, much less forcefully intervene in, the local conflict she describes. The courts eventually ruled the outcome a state matter, not a federal one, and subsequent federal legislation substantively confirmed the decisions of the city government anyway. In this case, thus, although contending domestic forces sought to use different levels of government to further their own particular ends, all three levels of U.S. political sovereignty played complementary roles in, as she puts it, converting the lands of the Mexican cession into American real estate. Maria Dolores Ballesteros ambitiously offers a discourse analysis of political leaders' views of the indigenous populations in all three countries that we're looking at this conference. And throughout, her emphasis is on the use of rhetorical devices by members of the national elites that reflect negative attitudes toward the indigenous peoples and that attempt to justify coercive policies toward them in the name of civilizing them or advancing civilization despite them. This study thus illuminates a crucial chapter in the history of these settler states, the ways in which they sought to remove the obstacles to European settlement and to the imposition of their own sole political sovereignty that the indigenous peoples represented. The paper could be strengthened, I think, by providing us with substantially more information about the social, regional, and political partisan identities of those figures whom it quotes. Maria Dolores knows this. She says at one point that it would be interesting to know more about the political actors involved in these debates, and I agree. Knowing just whom we're listening to could help us better understand the motives behind and to weigh the political impact of those words. And what of the words cited here that appear more sympathetic to the plight of the indigenous population, as well as to their needs and desires. Which sectors, I wonder, of the political elite expressed those opinions? How influential were they? Did their views leave a mark on government policy? The paper concludes by summarizing its findings regarding elite rhetoric. In general, it says, the indigenous populations are perceived as obstacles in the construction of national sovereignty in the three nations, and in each case, there is an effort to minimize or silence their presence in the past and present of the national territory. But her conclusion also suggests a significant distinction in policy, if I'm reading it correctly, a distinction that seems to hold at least most clearly between Mexico on the one side and the US and perhaps Canada on the other. Are these fundamentally important differences, I wonder? If so, how do we account for those differences in policy? Are the causes primarily ideological? Are they primarily demographic, having to do with the composition of the populations of those countries and the ratios between the European and the indigenous populations? Are there socioeconomic factors that help to explain this apparent distinction? And what, finally, should we make of the fact that these distinct policies could apparently be couched in substantially the same kind of discourse? A question which may suggest that, valuable as it is, discourse analysis has its limitations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. We have a bit over an hour for the discussion, but I think perhaps we should first send the microphone down the row here and see whether any of the presenters want to respond directly to the comments. So excuse me while I fumble with this. And might be easier just to go in order of seating. Do you want to say that?
Does anyone want it? Do you want to claim it?
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. Very good comments across the board. I don't know if this is even working, so we may need to do that. Populism leading to statism as opposed to anti-statism, which was one of the key points you made. Absolutely, that's the case. But let's not forget the inverse, the opposite trend, which I think is more important in late 19th century America, and that is anti-statism's persistence and the taking away of federal subsidies from international oceanic steamship companies in the late 19th century. That's the key development. So it's a choice between internal railroads and oceanic steamship companies. And I think this is central to understanding the limits of U.S. expansion in the late 19th century. We're so conditioned to think about its extent. I'm just as struck by its limits. And I think this is a very important bit of that story. So what attracts me to the Pacific Mail isn't just that it's a really interesting company, it's that it falls rather than rises. It goes against the standard narrative of the United States in this period.
Who's up?
I would just like to thank you for your comments. I think you, in fact, did make it, what? We've been in another conversation. But I wanted to thank Bruce for his comments, which I think were an excellent summary of what my argument is. I actually find more criticism of my paper in it, and I hope we'll have a chance to deal with it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I pointed it out in the paper. The next step is to study the context of these politicians, because some of them in the discussions said, well, my experience in the frontier was I lived there all my life and they are barbarous people and they have to be killed, blah, blah, blah. And others had a more moderate position, and that can also be explained by their context probably. So yeah, that's for sure. This is the first step, and I have to keep studying all the social, regional variations in all these actors. And yeah, okay, thank you.
Well, yes, I'd certainly like. Oh,
I think this
is it on?
working. I don't know.
You can hear. Be thinking about them very greatly. I suppose the question I have now is, where have we got with sovereignty?
Which I think was the question I started with. But let's go to yes, and I'll have to stand up to try to keep track of people. Please.
So this is not totally coherent yet, but I think it's mostly for Jay at this point, although a lot of what people were saying and picking up on Mark's point yesterday about economics struck me in this way. So I'm picking up on some threads from yesterday. I think territoriality was a big theme yesterday, about the mid-19th century as a moment in which the territorial state is ascendant and cemented. And then I think also some of Amy's points about individuals and how we think about individuals, and I would just add to that corporations. So again, I think this is mostly for Jay, which is, it strikes me that this moment in which we talk about the ascendancy of the territorial state is also the moment in which corporations, who are going to largely drive the move to a sort of more economic imperial mode of imperialism, are shifting gears. I mean, as that, the Southern Pacific or the Central Pacific is a great example of this, right? It's a moment where these railroad entrepreneurs, who are such a part of the national story that you start with, then are in the foreground of this move to, I don't want to say leave the state behind, but to just get much more open to which state they're going to deal with, right? And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What does it mean when we go from having a moment in which, I mean, as I say this, I even think, well, is there even a moment that way? Because as I look back earlier in the 19th century, I think people with economic interests are always a bit entrepreneurial about their state relationships. So do what you can.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and something that I'm thinking a lot about. And I think that the key thing to tease out of that is we don't have to make a choice. Are we telling a corporate story or a state story? And really what was a liberating kind of eureka moment for me in this project was realizing that the most important thing were the sets of relationships between corporate entities and state structures, and that is not just the U.S. state, it's also foreign states, and then the relationships between those two stakeholders and local actors. Local elites being really important if you're thinking about something like the Panama Railway, but let's not forget things like transnational labor. Labor is central to this story. So it's a very messy, complex, fluid set of relationships which we need to put under the microscope. It's not a choice, who are we going to talk about? We're talking about the relationships between these entities, and that's what I'm trying to do. But the key point is we don't think about corporate entities in this way very often. And that's my main intervention. And if we can bring them under the microscope, I'll be very, very happy.
Tony Kay. I guess I want to address Christopher's question about where we are with sovereignty, because as I read these papers and listened, I wanted to hear more about the state. And so I think Mary has found this really interesting kind of state formation in these cities where municipalities begin to assume a kind of state power that's usually reserved for the national state. In the other papers, I feel like the state is kind of underestimated. And so I think your own hunch and Bruce's suggestion to look at the political alignments in these languages is a really good one. And I don't know if you've begun to do that, but if you have anything more to say about how particular political alignments, how these things align politically, I'd be interested in hearing it. I think, Jay, you have this concept of corporate sovereignty. When I read the actual example that you have, it sounds to me not like corporate sovereignty, but autonomy, that they have the ability to control markets. But that's a power that in some sense is ceded to them, and that's part of the way state sovereignty works, that you can exercise power and you can cede power. And so I'd be interested in why isn't this an exercise in autonomy rather than sovereignty? And then in Chris's paper, I was every time I wanted to hear about something in your paper, you got to it the next paragraph. But I think your point that you made here, that this is a discrete period. This is a particular kind of state policy that is committed to, in effect, setting people up, to borrow an old terminology in yours, as household producers. And so maybe it would clarify the role of the state if you could talk about the difference between that regime and the one that it replaces. So if you think about the earlier 19th century regime, it's a kind of permissive, the state is permissive about the forms of labor. It establishes rules that enable free labor. It establishes rules that enable coercive versions of free labor, as Steinfeld and Christopher Tomlin have pointed out, and it establishes rules that permit slavery.
Yes.
So maybe if we compare those two sets of policies, we might begin to get a clearer sense of what the role of the state is in this, while still respecting your point, which is perfectly consistent with it, that people on the ground play an important role in this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I got the microphone, so I'll go first. Yes, thank you, Tony. I mean, that's a really good set of questions. And so as to the question about labor, one way of looking at this is that the only thing that is foreclosed is slavery. And many other things remain permitted. But I think there are other changes that are taking place, in a sense coincidentally, and I refer to them a bit in my paper, about the decline of other forms of formal coercion of one sort or another, imprisonment for debt, formal apprenticeship with qualifications, the ending of seigneurial tenures in parts of eastern Canada and so forth. On the other hand, certain forms of coercion remain licensed. Debt peonage and sharecropping, obviously, is the most prominent. But I think we can also talk about the forms of authority and, indeed, if necessary, coercion that exist within households. And I suppose one of the purposes of this project is to open up the family as a terrain of authority. And one of the resolutions, I mean, the big question, and I put it again in the paper, is the end of slavery comes at the wrong time. Right? It's a peculiar anomaly. Here is the United States particularly the United States, expanding. The land-labor ratio is growing. That should have reinforced slavery as a means of labor control, and yet it's overthrown. Now, obviously there's much to say, and has been said in many places, about how that happened. And one argument is that it was accidental, right? That the South really misplayed it. They thought they had all the cards, they played them, and they got beaten by these guys, which is why this is revolutionary. But the solution to the question of labor still needed to be found, and it comes in a number of ways. It comes in what happens within families. It comes in attempts to build large farms and wage labor for them, but those are unstable in many places in the 19th century. It later comes, and I sort of emphasized in the paper, the anonymous commentator didn't like this, but I was trying to stress that, the really big changes don't come about until the 20th century. Okay, there's some mechanization and so forth, but changes in crop yields, changes in productivity and so forth, changes in the composition of the rural population are really 20th century changes. So there's this period in which these questions are being fought out within families. The other part of your question is, and this now requires, I think, by me or somebody, a lot of examination, is how do farmers, in particular, exercise influence in state, particularly in state polities, during this period? What influence do they have? How do they compete with the influence of the commercial, corporate, mercantile elites who are also jockeying for power? Because, as Bruce perfectly correctly reminded us, the development of these market systems and technologies and so forth is taking place in parallel with this group. And I would tend to see this period as a period of struggle between these two groups, which eventually the bourgeois win. But I don't think my guys are necessarily bourgeois.
I'd like to talk about sovereignty a little bit more, but I'm wondering if, since it's a general question, whether we should get some more questions up before us before I intervene, which would be tempting to create a
We
longer.
could do a round of questions. I know a bunch of answers. Is that what you're suggesting, Mary?
Perhaps, but we need a little bit more feedback from the audience.
Okay, so I've got a lot of hands. I had Frank, and then I've got Mark, and Steve, and sorry, and there too. Okay, yeah.
I'm gonna go.
Burn the rest.
Yeah, this is probably just gonna be, the observation comment, maybe other questions afterwards. But let me start. I mean, I thought Lola's paper is interesting, especially in sort of thinking about one thing that's sort of working in that paper, I think, is that these national debates carry down to the grassroots level. That's kind of an assumption. And what Chris, Mary, and Jay have done is really complicate how much of that central power really matters when you get down to these local levels. And preparing for the conference, I started thinking of stuff we missed. And one thing is more British Empire work. In particular, I recently read John Darwin's The Empire Project. The book's very good. Who knows agree with them. The gist of that is, it's not an empire, it's an empire project, because there are all these ad hoc, non-state actors, mini-sovereignties, it's a hodgepodge of different forces, from capital in London to merchants on the ground to different army officers and so forth. And in some ways, each of you give examples of how that works in the US context. So I wonder if we are, to call into question the entire idea of this conference about remaking North American sovereignty, perhaps under the mask of three powerful nation states emerging out of the 1860s and 70s, that's the advertising. But what's really happening is the mobilization of these much more powerful, voluntaristic, autonomous mini-sovereignties like the steamship companies and the farmers and so forth.
All sovereignty is local.
Oh, sovereignty.
Okay, so we're going to go around. I've got Mark and Steve and then Ed, and then over here.
Okay, well, this is a response, Chris and Maria, Dolores, and also to Bruce's comments. In your, Chris, beginning with you, in your paper, and fully in the written form, and also what you've presented here, you say at one point, I jotted it down, in 1875, a more egalitarian property system swept across Canada and the United States. And I think Bruce very properly and justly and persuasively modifies that for the South, that in fact you have a whole major region of the United States, which begins to suggest that it's not a system sweeping across, but you're really talking about regionalization. In the North, great changes taking place beginning in the 1850s in terms of mechanization, the McCormick Reaper, and this addresses the whole labor shortage. But let's just build on that, because it's not only, what I'm suggesting broadly here is that it's not just this sort of free market individual, so homo economicus, but it's really culture that defines these systems. So the South has a culture of subordination which comes out of slavery and is reinstituted. If you go to Canada, and interestingly enough, we don't have a Canadian here on the panel, so I can speak freely. But in Canada, the feudal system's abolished in 1854, there's an this is in French Canada, there's this extraordinarily strong persistence. The feudal dues are abolished, but they're commuted, and the same land systems, the Psalms and Rentier, continue, and the same mentality continues in French Canada. The agriculture doesn't change, and it doesn't mechanize, it doesn't go that route. And then for Maria Dolores, what I would ask here is that the liberal reforms that take place are breaking down, as the Dawes Act would later, the idea of communal settlement. And my question here, which relates back to the same issue of culture, is what takes their place? My sense is, and please clarify it, my sense is that it's not particularly free peasant agriculture, that Mexico will then need another revolution in the early 20th century, that the bet is on large landholders, so that rather than, Christopher, that the spread of a more egalitarian property system is you have a particularly important large region, which is the north, but you have the south, French Canada, and Mexico, which you wouldn't say they're the exceptions. It's almost that the north stands out as an exception. Did you want to respond?
Well, I wasn't sure how long we wanted to go around.
No.
Yeah.
Because Maria Dolores, I'd like to hear you.
Okay, so we'll, all right, we'll stop here then.
Stop for a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, you have it right. Well, Erika Pani, I think, started explaining it yesterday. With this policy, with the liberal reform, lots of land from the church and also from the communal lands with certain specificities, but yeah, became available. And the only ones who in that moment were capable of buying those lands were rich, like really massive capitalist people. Yeah, that situation is especially significant up in the north. During the empire of Maximilian, Erika Pani has written about that. There was a kind of assembly that tried to help the indigenous population when claiming their lands and trying to keep those lands away, aside from that policy, from the policy of selling the communal land. But it's not, she said that we don't know how powerful they were in that negotiation, and if actually their lands were respected. Not that much, because as you have explained, you have later a revolution, special claiming those rights. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I take the point about the South, and I take your point about culture and deference and so forth. So one of the issues here is, what are the legal frameworks, which brings us back to the state and to the assumptions within which actions can be taken? And this is something I don't know very much about. I think this needs to be explored. What happens when conflicts arise and legal systems get invoked to resolve conflicts, does the local, as it were, does the local culture get followed, or do the presumptions of a freehold legal system start to exercise their role? And who are pursuing those things? Is this farmers seeking to use the system for their own advantages, or is it representatives of corporate or mercantile interests using the freehold system in order to obtain, to change the culture, as it were, or to push back against what you're calling the sort of residual local culture? Now, clearly in the South, that is very, very heavily tied up with the questions about race, and it's a very complicated question. I know much less about this in French Canada, and I don't quite know, or Prince Edward Island is one of the places, one of the last places where this happens, where the Supreme Court of Canada actually says, you know, we need freeholds. It's for the national interest. These questions are going to have to be worked out in detail and at the regional level. I agree with that.
Very quickly on Frank's important intervention about the nature of 19th century empire as a functioning entity. I absolutely agree, and I think this is something that historians of the United States need to pay more attention to. 19th century empires have no central brain. There is no central brain. They are formed from the outside in rather than from the inside out. The key text of the American empire would not be John O'Sullivan and Manifest Destiny, but for me it would be Federalist 10, about a pluralistic set of competing interests in an open marketplace and in an extensive sphere. And like so much else, the New Left historians of the 60s and 70s got it right in identifying that, but they got it wrong in how they interpreted it. And I think the way you laid out Darwin's conception of the British Empire is very much relevant to our project today. And that brings me to Tony's point about the state and corporations. It's not an either or. I mean, they're not distinct. It's about their synergy and their connections and how they interact with one another. And that's the key point to explore.
I'm going to intervene on sovereignty. I didn't want to pontificate a little bit about that, but I've been thinking about it not just in relationship to my paper and to the issue of by just going local, you get on the ground and you get more actors and you get more diversity in your story. But I wanted to talk about it more specifically about sovereignty, because as I've listened to all the other papers, I have a number of thoughts. One is that we have to remove some of the extraneous issues that have been, piled onto it, and identify it, if anything else, sovereignty is about governance and the place where decisive things can be done for a group as a whole. And that it has been since the Westphalian articulation of it, it is about certain kinds of territories. So I think to talk about individual sovereignty is to be kind of metaphorical. I think also, and I'm still tentative about this, to talk about the corporation as sovereignty, since it does become, at a certain moment in time in the 19th century, a private entity, but the first corporations were used for political places, and particularly cities. So I would sort of remove that too and accentuate in relation to the questions of economics that the corporation is about using the different levels of political sovereignty and can be very effective about that. So with that in mind, the thing that I heard is about sovereignty as politics and territory is that the nation state has been deposed a bit by all the different discussions. That globalism does it, and that may be, the story for the 21st century. But it also was there in the past. So many of our papers talked about treaties. There was a sort of supranational sovereignty being exercised. I think there's ways in which sovereignty is sort of, should also be removed in terms of much of the stuff about indigenous people. The Ohlone around San Francisco Bay are not sovereigns. I mean, that terminology doesn't work, and I suspect, you know, at earlier periods of European conquest, that just doesn't work, and we have to give credibility to that. But the other thing that I think that was really powerful is the way in which subnational sovereignty comes into play repeatedly. That in fact, the provinces in Canada and the states in the United States have incredible power. They certainly do about control of land, except for things like this. There is some public land left, but that's not most of it. And I think a lot of the story that we're talking about is taking the North America for private property. And in that process, and so that happens in terms of land, but we could categorize just from our contemporary history all sorts of things that are still left to the state. You know, marriage until very recently, critical parts of elections like apportionment. Even in the city of San Francisco, I'm happy to say, we do not abide by federal policy about immigration and refused, at the moment, to deport undocumented workers. So I think that sort of richer, more complex note of sovereignty, which is still incredibly important, and enough.
So I've got now Steve, and then Ed, and then over there, and then Greg, and then names here.
Well, first of all, I share Mary's concern about sort of piling on. And I think one of the things we've learned over the past couple of days are the limits as well as the usefulness of ideas about sovereignty. I actually have a sort of a question to try to link yesterday's plenary with some of the issues that have come up today, and especially Greg Downs' and Rachel St. John's work with some things here, including Chris Clark. And it has to do with looking at what's going on in the middle of the 19th century and then what's going on toward the end of the 19th century, which Chris in particular was pointing toward. You know, Greg was trying to draw our attention to a revolutionary process of state formation that links not only the three countries that we're looking at, but a lot of the hemisphere in general, indeed Europe as well. And then, of course, the projects that nation states pursue in an attempt to extend their authority over populations and their own sense of territoriality. Rachel, I think, and Pekka last night as well, was trying to sort of rein us in a little bit in recognizing some of the limits of the authority and power and the extent of the state, how alternative formations, if we want to call them sovereignties, or also populations who attempt to resist being ruled either by the central state or by other states. Chris is raising some very interesting questions about how state projects of extending their authority and developing what can also be regarded as colonial. Certainly the Trans-Pacific West, the language is a language of colonialism, and it's oftentimes referred to because it's so extensively territorialized as colonies. But at the same time, I think you're also suggesting that there are localized projects that grow out of that may have nothing to do with what the state intends. And I'm wondering, I mean, I've been sort of thinking about what goes on at the end of the 19th and early 20th century as kind of a second Reconstruction. And if you look at sort of the sweep of territory that you're interested in, whether you go from California up through the Upper Plains, you're looking at some really interesting political phenomena going out where the state is being reinvented by people on the ground, whether they're Bellamyites or Georgites out in California, or they're people who in Oregon who are coming up with remarkable new ways of thinking about how the state ought to be organized, to what becomes a nonpartisan league up in Minnesota. So I'm wondering about how this sort of works its way out, and whether, and this gets to, I think, a point that Mary's trying to suggest too, by looking at how state formation on the ground, or ideas about state formation on the ground, fit in to the projects that large states, you know, try to pursue. I mean, I do think that you're underestimating the extent of, for example, agriculture in California, which is massive. Operations that are heavily mechanized, they use really migrant labor. This is going on to some extent, those bonanza farms that briefly come in the upper plains. But, you know, some sense of the dynamic here, because I think these two sessions have laid out a very complicated but really interesting picture of how we get to the revolutions, political revolutions of the middle of the 19th century, to what might be regarded as a second Reconstruction. You know, if you think about, you know, where's the center, you know, one of the most powerful centers of socialism at the turn of the, it's Oklahoma. You know, a lot of it's in the trans-Mississippi West, where the relationships between radical farmers and radical workers probably it goes the furthest, where social democratic ideas are really nourished in ways that they're not in other parts of the country. And whether there's something about, you know, what we've been talking about, I'm not sure sovereignty is the, you know, the rubric that, you know, best, or contested sovereignties is the rubric that best captures this, but whether, yeah, I don't know.
And this happens in Canada as well. I mean, you know, Saskatchewan and sort of become the roots of rural radical movements.
And then, of course, you have, you know, what goes on in Mexico, the revolution, which, you know, is an immensely important event, although, you know, historians of the United States, it's like it never happened in you know, our own telling, even though it's on our border, and in many ways kind of puts together a lot of the threads, rural radicalism of the 19th century with the new kind of state formations that we associate with the 20th.
So I'm moving into territory, both geographically and chronologically, that I'm relatively unfamiliar with. So, but I guess I'm going to stick my neck out, because if it's going to be chopped off, I couldn't be chopped off in a nicer place. So some of these things have been traditionally handled under different headings. You know, so on the one hand we have populism, which then gets treated as a failure. On the other hand, we've had progressivism in the United States, and, you know, whatever the equivalent reform impulses have been in Canada, which have tended to be looked at from a kind of top-down perspective. And I think what Steve is pointing to now is the importance of linking up what we've been talking about with those political movements and looking at the effect that they actually have on the operation of politics within the nation states that had been created. In other words, things like the way the political system works, you know, what is it, referendum recall, and, you know, votes for women, the effect that these groups have. Now, one way of looking at that is to look at these as political movements that come from the grassroots in the context of the operation of this system, where it applies, and the conflict that it gets into with the commercial, capitalist, corporate world that is seeking to profit from it, and from which it also seeks to profit. And, you know, Bruce's reference to, you know, I got my students last semester to read the Omaha Platform. Once they realized that we're talking about, you know, public ownership of the railroads, this is the United States, right? I mean, it's beyond their comprehension, because this just isn't talked about now. And these were farmers who were asking for this, as Bruce points out. So I think that part of this story and part of the history that Mary is pointing us towards is actually reconstructing these political movements from the bottom up in this much bigger transnational and long-term context.
I mean,
Could
one
I-
of the things we do have to remember too, vis-a-vis the sort of state formation, is the way in which the American nation state also sponsors new classes of capitalists who then take off in their own particular direction here, and also to think about what's happening in the Trans-Mississippi West is kind of a proving ground for later overseas colonialism.
Yes.
If for no other reason than so many of the personnel
Yeah.
who were involved in it, are then involved elsewhere, and the extent to which it takes so long for these we talked a little bit about this yesterday, so long for these territories to be admitted as states, all sorts of cultural prerequisites that have to be resolved, whether it has to do with the rejection of polygamy, or it has to do with the demographic balances between the Anglo and Hispanic, populations, and so I mean I think it's sort of an interesting aspect of state.
Could I just intervene in a minute, because something that I saw in your paper, which actually I see as another way to kind of limit and define what we say with sovereignty, which you were talking, came into play political movements, democratic practices, resistance, all sorts of things that are not status, they come from outside the state. And those democratic practices shouldn't be lost in the focus about monolithic states. So I think that's really important to keep in play. It find me after 20 years, Habermas came back into view that we need a public sphere outside the state as a place of criticism for that. And I think, the North American continent is a place where a lot of that flourishes as a countermodel to the kind of status seen like a state model of places like France, for example.
I think next is Adam Lewis.
One of our guiding rules as historians is that nothing was ever the beginning of anything, really. We can always find deeper roots. And another one is that nothing has ever been the end of anything, because we're extending this well forward into the 20th century, it seems. And that's great. I'm glad about this format. Frank, are you here? Yeah, maybe. Because we can keep this going. We've read these papers and we can circulate to one another. But I'm struck by a couple of things that emerge from Jay's paper and from the paper by Maria Dolores, because they bear on my nothing ever was, nothing ever will be kind of problem. In Jay's case, I like the paper enormously. I want to know more about it as it goes along. I also thought, perhaps you already do this, perhaps I missed it in a fast reading, but I also thought about what Tony Wallace did long ago in Rockdale, and what, I forget the name of the author now, but it's Transatlantic Industrial Revolution, where the Atlantic context, the larger context, is very important in terms of industrial transformation. And I was wondering how that would apply beyond saying that the forerunners of Cunard are in competition with the forerunner, with Pacific Mail. And I hope that in your project you think more about that, because I'm sure there's a community of mariners and seafarers who deal with this. And in the case of Maria Dolores, I like the paper enormously. But I found one thing that I'd like to hear more about again. Pekka got at this last night, that indigenous knowledge and indigenous action don't just go poof. I kept hammering on this every time I've spoken. And working on the eastern woodlands in an earlier chronological framework, I found the same thing. And so I agree with what Bruce said. I'd like to know more about the people whom you hear speaking. Are they Republicrats? Are they Democrats? What are they? And that would be a play in Mexico and Canada too. But I'd also love to see indigenous knowledge come to play here. It's increasingly clear, you know that, Pekka, you demonstrated it, and from the point of view of what interests me, that can be done. This is a suggestion, but it bears, I've kind of reversed my order here, because the question of indigenous knowledge bears on what was there before the Europeans showed up with all their projects, and the question of the transatlantic, maybe industrial, commercial, corporate connections bears on what we continue to live with. More a comment than anything else, but I did want to get it out. Thanks.
Let's go over here. Finally, impatient.
Oh, well, my thought was very much along the lines of Frank's and Mary's about, sovereignty being local and these subnational forces. But I also was thinking about how that could be connected back to the sort of NAFTA history that we're talking about this weekend. And one way it seems to me of doing that is with Jay's work about the connections between nation states that these local struggles make possible. And I also think some of the sort of present day analogies that were coming up are instructive here. I come from Houston, so I've arrived here from the other end of a certain pipeline that has been built not just through the exercise of nation-state power, but in Texas, the exercise of eminent domain by the state to seize land to make this larger continental project possible. The headlines, as I've been here too, since I think Ed was talking about portable embarrassment, is about Texas now being sued by immigrants who are being denied U.S. birth certificates by state registrars in Texas. So on the other end of NAFTA as well, and I don't think this is just the case of the state of Texas or even just a 21st century issue, but that in the 19th century as well, these local subnational sovereignties facilitate and also become obstacles to these continental and transnational relationships. And along those lines, I had a question for Mary because unfortunately I think your paper was in the Google Drive but not the Dropbox that I was looking at, so I didn't get a chance to read your paper. I apologize. But you were talking about your interest in going down to Central America, and I was curious about sort of what that side of the project is as you were going down the Pacific coast. So just a question for what that side of it is.
Well, it was mostly just in terms of landscape issues, which are represented very much there, but it does come into all sorts of issues of sovereignty that I wish I knew more about, because in fact what happens into issues of property, and particularly of multiple sovereignty in California, it draws on, the Spanish Constitution of 1812 and is reworked in 1824 and reworked in 1836. And with each reworking, what happens is there's a different designation of political territory and geography. So San Francisco, which I also think speaks to spatial issues much more widely, can be seen, if you look at those pictures, it can be created in a ayuntamiento, which is a sort of local constituency and justices of the peace. But then at another moment, it becomes a configuration of, 40 miles around. At another point, it's the Partido de San Francisco, which could be, a third of the state of California. But it's always, again, that the power of certain elites and the lack of power of other elites is affected by the geography of politics and different levels. And I think my ranchers on the San Francisco Peninsula will use those institutions for acquiring property and land, just like almost as quickly as the real estate speculators or then the very precocious capitalists in Baltimore. So I would, love to talk more about this, and I'm still puzzling over an equally, for Alta California, an equally complicated system of multiple sovereignty.
Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes left to go. I've got on my list here, I've got Greg and Elliot and Lindsay over there, and then Joel. So I guess we can do 3 or so questions quickly if you can, and then maybe a very fast response, and then a final round. We may have time for that. So Greg, you're
I'd like to pick it up on Mary's point about the utility of pontification, which I mean totally sincerely. I'd like to invite you to betray the title of it and to pontificate on another word that floats behind several of the papers. In capitalism. And the oddity as a 19th century U.S. historian at a moment where a burst of in many ways salutary work on the history of capitalism and slavery has made the equation so clear that I think it's a perilous time to figure out the history of of other forms of capitalism in North America, and especially of different varieties of northern-based capitalism, and what that tells us about the North and what it tells us about whether with the meaning of the word underneath it, and I was especially prompted by Chris's notion of that you're not interested in calling the farmers that you work with bourgeois, why that matters and how we can start to get some purchase on how we would rebuild a project of understanding the capitalist development of North America that is not subsumed in slavery.
Just very quick question for Chris and a very quick comment. Regarding your idea of this period as a revolutionary effort to open up vast areas of the West to freehold, I wonder if you've thought at all about sort of the first cousin of farming, and that is ranching, which is also rising up as a sort of a new phenomenon, modern ranching in the West, and which is portrayed rhetorically and eventually mythically much along the same lines, that is, individual opportunity. But in fact, by the early 1880s is arguably one of the most corporatized businesses in the country. And secondly, as a general comment playing on that, there are those, who would argue that if there's a revolutionary development going on in the West, it's the West leading the way in the country toward corporatization, toward the rise of big business in ranching, in mining, in forestry, extractive industries, railroads, obviously. And perhaps this can help us understand to riff a little bit on what Steve Hahn, the point he was making about these anti-monopolistic groups. So many of them, again, come out of the West, not just in agrarian organizations, but in mining, the Western Federation of Mining, and the miners and the Wobblies and so forth. So maybe that's at least as important a development that's going on out there.
Thank you. Lindsay?
I guess I'm sitting here as a sort of British, becoming a British tradition, Canadian and American, and thinking, Americans invented a weird idea of sovereignty. And they rooted it in the people rather than in a unitary parliament. And when you have sovereignty rooted in a unitary parliament, you can take Jay's people and say, okay, wait, well, we chartered that corporation and it's creating an empire and it's going out there and it's doing the things of the unitary parliament. When you locate sovereignty in people, what the hell are they all doing? They could be doing anything and they're all sovereign. And so I'm still in this kind of weird conceptual problem. Like, I think, thinking about, if you're standing on the banks of the Red River, in what's now Manitoba, in 1860, let's make it 1871, you can look around and you can say, okay, those people are making a sovereignty claim. We as Métis people are making a sovereignty claim. We can look for kind of indicia of sovereignty. We can say, well, we're sovereign or they're sovereign, but we don't get to, and we base our sovereignty claim in our history as a people, in our practices of governance, we have a space, we have rules, we have procedures, but not just in the fact that we're here, that we're just people that came to this place. So, I don't know, I'm just having this kind of feeling like I'm not sure that as a Canadian that I could fully get the nature of this, the possibility of having a divided sovereignty that's so divided that you can talk about populist groups as being sovereign.
Meaning that you fundamentally don't understand we the people in the same way that none of us fundamentally.
Okay, let's turn it back over to the panel for responding.
Okay, I'll go first on the point about capitalism, and of course it's like sovereignty or democracy or empire. It's one of these things where we can cram a lot into that spandex, but no one ever looks good in spandex. And one of the things that I'm interested in doing is sort of the next generation of the new capitalism stuff, which isn't really that new. I've got to say that, but is to begin to qualify, to specify, looking at the fine grain. So I'm developing this idea of transport capitalism, a very particular kind of capitalism linked to money markets, managing long-haul transport and distance. How do you manage that in a new era? And in particular, how do you mobilize resources, coal, on behalf of this enterprise? So I think we need to specify these concepts to qualify them. I know that means it's a mouthful and people might recoil against that, but that's what we do. That's what we've done with previous concepts. Think about republicanism. It's gone through all these phases and now we qualify it. No one talks about republicanism in the singular. It's always qualified or specified. And we need to keep doing that with capitalism and indeed with sovereignty.
I would on the capitalism question, I would add see this as an invitation to give an anecdotal information from the Baltimore side of my story and to speak to the issue of capitalism and railroads and to point out by watching the East Coast model of building a city, we go through a certain kind of municipal pre-capitalist world in that it was very mercantile, and the public sector was very much a contributor to the advance of the market and profiteering. And the best example of that I know is the first long-haul railroad, the B&O, was founded, got its capital from the public sector, from the taxpayers of the city of Baltimore. And so that's a really interesting story. So I don't want to go up in that. But as to your question, it's interesting to me because, and it's another reason to employ sovereignty as a specifically government process, because in fact the notion of we are the people might be worked rhetorically, but governments will decide who's really titled to citizenship in that. And it wasn't you and me in this period, which I would like to remind us of. That the gender that's gotten lost too much, I think, in all this. Not just the gender, the women.
Yeah, I would like to answer some of the questions. I am referring to the people who are discussing these texts, the voice of these politicians. In the Mexican case, I have found that there is a difference between the politicians who belonged to the center of the country, who were used to indigenous populations that are settled there, that are peaceful and they are more compassionate towards indigenous population in general in the country, against representatives from the northern frontier, as Professor Marcela explained yesterday, or even people from the Yucatan Peninsula who were arguing that the only way of dealing with them was to exterminate all of them because they were crazy people. So that's what I've found in Mexico. I have to start studying that in the U.S. and in Canada because this is just starting. That's what I said in the beginning. And about the indigenous voice, surprisingly or not, I don't know. In the three cases, it's in Canada where I have found in the journals of the assemblies some complaints of specific indigenous populations about the commissioner figure. So in the U.S. case, I have found claims of certain compensations for attacks or things like that, but always voiced by the Indian Affairs people. But that's the only. And in Mexico, they are not no way to be found in any of these documents. But it's important. I get your point, and it's I can have the other approach, the other view of the same situation. Thank you.
Yeah, rather a lot here, isn't there? Capitalism.
You only get about 2 minutes in this round, maximum.
Well, one of the ways I would think about this is that I think there is a conflict between the people who are on the ground and the systems that they're trying to work with. And that is the story of the later 19th century. And if we see farmers as not as bourgeois, we can understand that conflict better than if we assume that they're all in the same game, because their game is different, although they have many intersecting interests. One of the facets of the northern agrarian model, and this goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, including, Ed, things that didn't begin now and haven't ended yet, is to do with settlement patterns and the relationship between local elites and what's going on the land. And I've written this before. In the South, before the Civil War, and to some extent afterwards, the people who owned the land were also the bosses. That was not the case not the case in the north. The people in the north who were making the money were not the owners of the land on the whole. They were the merchants and ultimately the corporate owners of businesses that did business with them. And in North America, at least, certainly in the United States, under this so-called northern model, settlement is widely dispersed, elites are widely dispersed. There isn't a central capitalist class. They're widely dispersed in cities and towns across the landscape. So that's part of the story. Farming and ranching, as Professor Westers raised for us, yes, this is a famous conflict, of course. I mean, there's a lot of stories about what happens when farmers arrive and want to farm land that is already claimed by ranchers. And this is would be another aspect of that class conflict, in a way, because many of the ranches are, as you've said, owned by corporate interests, many of them from the East, who are employing wage labor. They solve the land labor problem in a different way by this very extensive system. So there's huge amount of land, very little labor, but you're running cattle or whatever, and so you don't need much land, but you do need the land. And if other people are claiming the use of the land, or they want to fence it or whatever, that leads to conflict, and these are well-known stories. As for, and indeed Eastern capital and increasingly indigenously produced capital is, as you've already also said, mining interests and so forth, and those feed into this story. So then there's the question of, what happens, how do the people exercise sovereignty? And often, of course, they don't, or they can't, but they try to and they claim to. And part of my answer to this would be, we have to look at what happens in the court. Because it's how laws are made and applied, not how laws are made, but how they are interpreted. And how legal precedent actually sets out the rules for running a system that actually actually tells us how the system works eventually. And there are winners and losers in that. I mean, in theory, in a parliamentary system, the majority in Parliament decides who the winners and losers are going to be under any particular facet of legislation. That's predetermined. Often, in the 19th century anyway, in the US, as these systems are developing, it's court decisions as people come into conflict with one another. And they go to a court and a judge says, you're right, or you're wrong, or whatever. And they kind of work their way into figuring out who the winners and losers are. And the people with money, of course, are in a better position to use the law than people without it, in the hope of swaying decisions in their way. But they don't always win. It's a bad answer to a very good question.
Okay, I still have 4 names on the list here, and Frank, perhaps you'll give us dispensation to continue.
Because our next session doesn't start until 1, I'm going to say that if we take a few more minutes here, people can still get to lunch in the next panel. So, Hendrik.
Okay, so the people I have on the list, I've got Amy, George, Brian, and Tom, and I think that we'll have to stop it at that point. And I suppose if you really want to be first in line for lunch, you just kind of vote with your feet, and then the rest of us will realize that this discussion does have to end at some point. So without further ado, Amy, you're next.
Mary, I wanted to thank you for your paper because it's really the only paper here, at least that I've heard, and I haven't been in the afternoon panels that were opposite of the ones that I was at, that really addresses the kind of sovereignty that lies at other levels of government besides the state. And I'm thinking in the panel that I was on yesterday, Adam Rothman making a comment about, like, I know what states are, and, a state like Texas or something like that. And then Caleb's comment, made me think that there might actually be a lost opportunity here to see the ways in which these other levels of government, so municipalities and actually states, what role they played as themselves in this larger issue of the consolidation national border. So I just wanted to put that out there. So thank you. I feel like, 20 years ago, it seems like urban history had more of a presence places than it does now. And it's just nice to be reminded that a lot of things happen on the municipal level that aren't obvious when you pull back.
You know what, I'm going to forego because Elliot West got most of my questions.
Right. Yeah, this is more of just a comment about the discussion, and I appreciate so much the complexity of maybe adding layers to sovereignty and thinking about really decentering the nation state. But I also just want to have a little bit of a word of caution about too much of that. And it goes back to some of the things that Professor Bender mentioned and that Susan Mary Grant mentioned yesterday or previous days about how the nation still is an important thing. And maybe the nation state isn't the right word, maybe the federal state. But one of the things that brings us together here is that people were willing to fight and die and lose their lives for the protection of some entity that was above all of these things. And so it strikes me that part of our challenge moving forward is how is it we reintegrate these places in which it's anti-state, or it's how do we bring that back to reshape our understanding of that entity, which, at least in this conversation, hasn't been a central player. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to certainly endorse what was just said, but also come back to what Mary said about sovereignty, and I think that a lot of this has been happening here over these couple of days. Is sovereignty and power are being mushed together, and they have to be separated. That sovereignty, is going back to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. It belongs to essentially a territorial political entity, and this entity can allocate power. It can give power, and it can give privileges. And one of the biggest privileges is corporation. I mean, so your private, in terms of Jay, this private thing is actually a quasi-public thing. And now they've gotten completely out of control, but at least there was a little bit of control for a while. But it goes two ways. The same federal government that is enabling the incorporation, not only of your corporation, but many others. Also, the federal government used its power of sovereignty. They allocated that power to individuals with the homestead thing. You can have this. This is a great resource. This is a bigger resource than they gave the mail company thing. So I think there is this power of sovereignty that is based upon a territory since 1648. But that sovereignty can do various things. And the wonderful example, someone mentioned that the problem in New York City now is nothing functions. All of the Dillon Rule, which was an 1868 ruling in Iowa, determined that cities were not political entities. They are only administrative agents of the state. So New York State, and this happens in all other states, decides what we can do on our own. The law's just finding out it's not much of anything. So anyway, I think it's really important. The main thing I wanted to say is this merging of power and sovereignty is being real messy.
Okay, so let's have one more round for the panelists to respond to anything or conclude.
Thanks for invoking Dylan. It's really important because that is something that's a municipal history that's coincides with the 18th, and I think that's a major one in which, in fact, some of these layers of sovereignty are, in fact, in conflict with one another. Two different police forces, in New York City, 150 years ago. So.
I think picking up on that, absolutely great point about the state outsources or empowers. In Chris's paper, it empowers the small landholders through the Homestead Act. But it's a two-way traffic, isn't it? And that's what his point is. How do they then go back to the state and shape a policy thereafter? I think it's the same thing if you're looking at railroads or steamship companies. And the question is, on a case-by-case basis, who holds that preponderance of power? How is it leveraged? And what I'm struck by is the limits of state authority or state power from the central state outside of the United States, and the emergence of corporate power and its exercise. But it's an uneven story, and it's contingent upon time and place. So I think that your model of thinking about it is absolutely right. I just emphasize what you surely know is that it's a two-way traffic rather than a one-way.
Can I just jump on that real quick? I think one thing that I think is important, I think that's a really helpful distinction in my work in particular. I think there are probably places where I'm actually talking, at least from the federal perspective, about power. But one of the things I think is concerning about going back to this Westphalian definition is that it presumes that certain states that claim power through Westphalia get to decide who gets power and who doesn't. And so for Native nations in particular, that's really problematic. And I think actually you see with going back to the people, at various stages, people, including my Mormons in some case, say, it's nice that you think you're sovereign, but we, the people, either through the US Constitution or through a divine calling in the case of the Mormons, actually assert their own claims of sovereignty. But I think particularly in the case of Native people, it's really important because this is used over and over again to deny fundamental Native claims. I think there's a real debate right now about whether sovereignty is the word you want to use for Native claims or not. But they certainly have claims that precede Westphalia.
Right. Those claims have a great deal of more resonance when there's a recognition of that sovereignty. So in that sense, the recognition part is still important.
But, I mean, to pick up on Tom Bender's point, when the state licenses people to become owners of particular areas of property, I mean, one of the things that 18th and 19th century Americans in particular are very conscious of is seeking to throw off what they saw as the feudal remnants of a system in which their legal entitled to the land proceeded from above, from the king. And so there's this great effort in the late 18th, and I'm amazed to discover that it keeps continuing in the 19th century, to declare land holdings to be allodial, that is, held without any notion of a feudal title. And there are state constitutions that are written with clauses to show this. But there's a very interesting question, which goes directly to this question of sovereignty and power. If you go on the internet now, I don't recommend this. There are property rights advocates who argue that because they hold their land allodially, they have no obligations to anybody else or to the state, right? And they keep going to court to say that, we don't have to pay taxes, or we don't have to comply with eminent domain provisions, we don't have to consider our neighbors. And the law is very clear about this, and it's been repeatedly stated that these people are wrong. That you don't own your land outright, you always own it, as it were. Eric Freifogel has put this very well in a book. You own it, as it were, against other people. And that there are obligations that come with it, which include the obligation to pay taxes, the obligation to obey the law, quiet possession, and you are subject to eminent domain provisions. But that context is right on the ground, that conflict is right on the ground. And that speaks a lot to the question of the ground roots of sovereignty.
Do you want to say anything at this?
I just want to explain briefly that I was a little bit mistaken. In Mexico, the Protective Assembly for the Helpless People was a space where they could be heard, but a little bit about what you said. They could claim their lands, the ownership of their lands, but they had to present documents from the Spanish Empire, from the municipalities, from some physical papers, and sometimes Pani has explained this more, but their claims were were normally not here because they didn't follow the form, the official form that used. And this protective assembly, what made was accept their claims and ask for further documentation or things like that. But at least they hear them a little bit more than other institutions.
Okay, well, thank you very much all. Thank you.